Hello and welcome back to Project 380. In this video I'm going to be bleeding all 6 brakes, which includes the standalone hydraulic handbrake setup, bleeding the clutch and setting the handbrake up. In the last few videos I've installed some Wilwood big 4-pot brakes on the front with some destroy or die front flexi line, the original brake calipers with some destroy or die lines, a standalone hydraulic handbrake setup with a second set of rear calipers using the destroy or die rear hub, a Wilwood big clutch master cylinder, braided line, and all of those, including the clutch, need bleeding up. And I'm going to start at the master cylinder. This is completely bone dry, so I'm going to fill this up to the brim with some DOT 5.1, which has a slightly higher boiling point. Really and truthfully, if you're putting a new master cylinder on your car, you should really bench bleed it. In other words, before you install it in the car, you loop some pipe from the bottom of the master cylinder on each port up back into the reservoir and keep pumping it until all the air is gone. You will get a bit of air back in the master cylinder when you put it on the car and reconnect the brake lines, but it's a good way of getting most of the air out of the master cylinder first. But as you can see, I've already installed mine and all the lines, so what I'm going to do is let gravity do the work for me. So make sure you pop the reservoir cap on just loosely so air can still get in it, but no debris can get in. With that topped off to the brim, I'm going to bleed the brake that is furthest away from the master cylinder over here because it's a right hand drive, which is the rear left hand brake. Sorry about the car, it's still a bit of a mess. And because I've installed the proportioning valve, we want to wind the valve all the way in, which opens it up. This is going to make the backs easier to bleed. On the rear left hand brake, I'm going to take off the cover on the bleed nipple, then attach some clear silicone tube that fits snugly on the bleed valve, like so. Put the end of that tube into a jar to collect all the fluid that's going to come out, and undo the bleed nipple about 1/3 of a turn. Doing this is in the hope that all the air will come out of the caliper that is furthest away from the master cylinder first. So we're going to let this do its thing for a few minutes, come back to it and check on it. Make sure you're periodically coming back to the master cylinder reservoir and topping that off. Make sure it doesn't go below minimum. If you let this go too low, it can reintroduce air back into the system. I let it do its thing for about 5 minutes, came back to check on it, and I can see I've got a little leak. So I'm just going to have to retighten that joint there and leave it for another 5 minutes. I've come back to this about 5 minutes later and it's all dry. It turns out it's this top pipe. I didn't actually screw it into this T-block. So I'm going to come back in another 5 minutes, make sure this bit's all dry again and check the left hand rear caliper. Back at the left rear caliper now, and as you can see the jar has started to fill up. At about the 10-minute mark I started getting fluid up the top of the pipe, so I just let this drain for about 5 minutes longer in the hope to get as much air out as I possibly can by gravity bleeding it. So I'm going to lock that bleed valve off and take the pipe off. Grab a rag and wipe off the excess fluid before it drips all down the caliper and makes a mess. And then move on to the second furthest away from the master cylinder, which is the rear right hand brake caliper. So I'm going to go and top off the master cylinder reservoir again and leave this to go for 10 minutes. There it goes. With the right rear having run through for a couple of minutes, it's now time to move on to the third furthest away from the master cylinder, which is the front left hand side. I was a bit restricted for space on the left hand side of the car, so I've gravity bled that off of camera. The only one left is the front right. So as you know from a previous video, I fitted the Wilwood front calipers, which have 4 bleed screws. 2 at the bottom underneath and 2 at the top. We're not going to touch the bottom 2 as that may reintroduce air into the system. So we're just going to concentrate on the top 2, and you do need to bleed both of these just in case air is trapped over either side. So I'm going to start with the inner bleed screw first, get all the air out of there, and then onto the outer bleed screw. Because these are Wilwood calipers, they do take a 1/4 spanner. With the main brakes all gravity bled, I'm going to do exactly the same to the hydro. Because the destroyed eye standalone hydraulic lines are equal lengths at the back, it really doesn't matter which side you bleed up first. As you can see, I'm doing the right side, and that's been bleeding for 10 minutes and there's no air coming through, so I'm now going to go bleed the other side. And exactly the same for the clutch reservoir. It's a bit hard to get me and the camera in there, but you can see there, that is the clutch slave cylinder with one bleed nipple on top. You just treat that the same as any other brake caliper. With those three systems all gravity bled, and you've got rid of most of the air in those systems, you may still have a little bit of air left in there. So we want to get rid of that excess air, and there is a few methods of doing that. The first off is a one-man bleed hose. So this is just a bit of hose with a one-way valve in the end, where you slip on the bleed nipple, undo the bleed nipple, and then keep pumping the pedal until there's no air come out. A similar tool to this is a bleed bottle, and some of these come with a ball bearing in the end of the tube that's inside the bottle, which works as a one-way valve, and you could bleed this all by yourself. This one doesn't have that ball bearing in the end, so it's just a pipe in a bottle to collect all of the fluid that you're pushing out. A tool more commonly found in garages is a fluid extractor. So this end of the tube would sit on the bleed nipple, and you would attach the bottle to an air compressor, and it will suck all the fluid and air out and catch all that fluid in this reservoir. These are really good, but they can be quite expensive. Very similar to that is a vacuum tester with an inline bottle. So you manually pump this up and it should draw all the fluid and air through and catch it in the bottle. The last tool is a pressure bleeder. These attach to the top of the reservoir, pressurize the whole system up, and you can quickly go around and open up each bleed nipple until all the air comes out. But commonly, as I've found, they don't fit older Japanese cars, so I've left mine at work. But lastly is the method I prefer and trust the most, and that is the two-man bleed. There'll be one person in the car pressing the brake, pressing the clutch, or pulling on that hydro, and the other person with a pipe, a bottle and a spanner at each bleed nipple, and communicating as a team to bleed the whole system of air. And I'm gonna go around and bleed all three systems again to make sure I've got no air in there. If there is air in any of the systems, they're gonna feel horrible and spongy, and they're not gonna perform how they should. So all I need now is a second set of hands or feet. Help. So I've got Rowan to come help me, because he's the only one tall enough to do this without having the seat installed. So on my command, he's going to press the pedal when I say down, and then release it when I say up. So I'm going to do this in the same order as when I gravity bled it, and I'm going to start with that corner over there, move to this one, then to the left hand side front, and then onto the right hand side front. I've got my spanner, my pipe and my reservoir ready. So I'm going to open up the bleed nipple and shout down, and Rowan will press the brake pedal down. He's going to hold it down until I say up, then I'm going to close the bleed nipple up and shout up, and he'll release the pedal, and then you just repeat this process until all the air is out of this clear line. Down, up, down, up, down, up. When doing this, make sure you don't go below the minimum mark and fill it up between each caliper. Once the rear lift has run completely clear of air and the reservoir's filled up, you can then move on to the right hand rear. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. With all those bled up, Rowan's going to stomp on the pedal a little bit, and I'm going to check all around the system for leaks. With the main brakes all bled up, it's now time to move on to the hydro. This works exactly the same, but when I say down, Rowan's going to pull on the hydro, and when I say up, he's going to let go. down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. Again, the same with the hydro. We're going to hold the hydro back and check for leaks. Down, up, down, up, down, up. With all the brakes bled up, not leaking and holding pressure, it's now time to move on to the handbrake. I've installed all 3 brand new handbrake cables, and a couple of episodes ago I actually slackened off the handbrake inside the cab so I could install the handbrake cables onto the new caliper, and that all needs setting up. Without the car being on a lift, it's a bit difficult to film how to adjust it at the caliper, so I've got an old caliper to demonstrate on first. Welcome back to my very used temporary workbench. As you can see, I've got an old caliper here, and all you're going to need is a 4mm Allen drive on a ratchet and a 14mm spanner. Now on the caliper, people like to call this the hidden adjustment, but on the back there are 2 14mm bolts. This bolt holds on the bracket that holds the handbrake cable to the caliper, and this one, if you remove with a 14mm spanner, inside you will actually see a little Allen drive. Using a ratchet, you can simply adjust this tighter and looser until the handbrake works how it's required to. You can also pull these out, and as you can see, it's just a spline. It's a good idea if you've got an old caliper to clean these up and give it a fresh coat of grease and put it back in. Once it's all adjusted, all you've got to do is pop the bolt back on. Now to adjust the handbrake on the car, make sure the handbrake inside the cab is all the way down and the adjuster is slackened off. Remove the bolt from the back of the caliper and start adjusting the caliper up. You should feel it go quite tight. Once you feel it go tight, just back it off a little bit and then see whether you can turn the disc. If you can't turn the disc, back it off a little bit more and make sure it's not binding. Once you're happy with how it's set up and it's not binding, you can put that bolt in the back of the caliper and tighten that up, and do the same to the other side. With the backs all adjusted up, we're now going to come and adjust the handbrake inside the cab. And to do that, we're just going to take a big flat-headed screwdriver and just keep twisting the adjustment screw until you start to feel quite a lot of resistance, about 5 or 6 clicks up. The easiest way to tell whether your handbrake is set up properly is to pop a wheel on and put the handbrake up 5 or 6 clicks, and with a torque wrench set to 110 Newton meters, if you can torque the wheel down without the wheel moving, the handbrake is set up correctly. If the wheel moves slightly, like so, the handbrake still needs more adjustment. And if you release the handbrake, spin the wheel and make sure it's not binding. So that is all the main brakes, the hydro setup and the clutch all fully bled, and the handbrake all set up. If this video helped you in any way, make sure you leave a comment down below and a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. So Rowan's coming. For bruh's sake. Help.